Mervyn Prior with you through until 6 o'clock. Anatomy of a Nation, a history of British identity in 50 documents is what we're talking about on the programme now. New publication by Dominic Selwood. And I'm pleased to say Dominic's with us on the programme now. Good afternoon, Dominic.
Hello, good afternoon. Thank you for having me on the programme.
You're very welcome. What's your background to actually creating this publication?
Well, I'm a historian and I write for a number of the country's newspapers on history, and I've written some history books. And then years and years ago, I studied history, but I also qualified as a lawyer. So my day job, I'm also a barrister. But history is what has got me writing this book.
Now, the thing that's caught our eye, we know Lincolnshire is mentioned in several places within the publication, but also, of course, Lincolnshire-born Sir Isaac Newton features in the publication as well. Tell us a bit about his involvement.
That's right. And, he's one of my favourite characters in the book, because what I really, really find fun about history is not the battles and dates and all that stuff, which, bores all the school children, but actually the things that you don't expect. And Isaac Newton is one of those characters that we really don't understand. And we've all kind of got a strange misconception about him. You're absolutely right. He was born in Lincolnshire at Woolsthorpe Manor, about 7 miles south of Grantham, in 1642. And we think of him as one of the kind of great leading lights in the Enlightenment, in science, in developing, experimental science. And so physics, for example, the modern subject of physics basically was invented by Isaac Newton, because before him there was just natural philosophy, but he came up with this, these golden rules of light and optics and motion and gravity and all those things. But what's so fascinating is that he wasn't actually particularly interested or fixated in science himself. He was a deeply, we could talk about this, but a deeply religious person. He came to be deeply religious, and he's using this science as just one tool among a whole lot of different tools to prove the existence of God and creation. So actually, we think that science and religion often these days are very different things. For him, his scientific studies were just as important as his alchemical studies or his studies of King Solomon's temple or, ancient mysticism. These are all just ways of proving creation. So we think of him as this very rational scientist. But John Maynard Keynes, the economist, who was the guy who really brought to everyone's attention that Newton had these interests, because he went to Sotheby's and he bought a whole collection of Newton's papers in 1936. And until then, they'd been hidden. No one had known about them, because when he died, another member of the Royal Society found all these alchemic papers in Newton's study and bundled them up and put a label on them saying, "Do not publish," because he thought it would wreck his reputation. So it didn't come out until just before the Second World War. And Keynes read all this stuff and he said, "My God." And there's the kind of very memorable quote. He said, Newton wasn't the first of the scientists. He was the last of the magicians. So yeah, fascinating man.
Really is. And now the book itself, then, you've brought along these key documents to publish then. And what do you include then of Sir Isaac Newton?
Right. So his most famous work is the mathematical principles of natural philosophy. It's usually known by its Latin name, the De Principia, because in his day, science was called natural philosophy. It's before it was, really called science. So he was writing about the mathematical principles of natural philosophy. And that is sort of the book that put his name on the map and that he's super famous for. But in the book, I didn't want to choose all the things that people know. So I didn't include Shakespeare. I didn't include the obvious stuff. I wanted things that was different and would give us a slightly different perspective. Yeah. So for Isaac Newton, I've chosen, he's got these hundreds of notebooks. And in one of the notebooks, he writes out in Latin the very famous alchemical text called the Emerald Tablet. And then he translates it into English. Lots of different people have done it over the years, but we have Isaac Newton's translation of the Emerald Tablet. So I've used that because it's fascinating, because we can talk about, in the book then about alchemy and why someone like Newton, who was so fascinated with this really rational science, why he was also deeply fascinated by alchemy, which was in his day, a pseudoscience. It wasn't particularly well thought of even then. I mean, it had been in the past, but, even in his day, it wasn't. But he just couldn't get enough of it. He used to work day and night at his rooms at university with his, stills and alembics and crucibles and, doing all this stuff. And, for him, alchemy was important because he thought that the building blocks of creation were, he didn't use the word atoms, but, basically things a little bit like atoms. And how they interacted was how subjects and objects and matter was assembled. So he thought that if you could heat them up in the right way or combine them with the right things, you could disassemble and then reassemble them in different ways. So you could turn a piece of lead into a piece of gold, not because you wanted to go and make lots of money or some quack, but because that was just logical. If you could get the sort of the chemical glue to undo things and then glue it back together again, well, then you can do that. So to him, it made complete sense. It was just as scientific as calculus or gravity or optics. But he was fascinated by this alchemy. So I chose his alchemical, one of his most famous alchemical texts.
It's absolutely amazing. And it amazes me to think, somebody has this brain, all those years ago, things that we perhaps take for granted now, but he was discovering these things at that time as well.
He was, and lockdown, of course, had brought out some stories about Isaac Newton in the early days, because people were saying, well, what am I going to do with my lockdown? I should do something like get Duolingo and learn Welsh or something. And people kept on saying, Isaac Newton used his lockdowns really well, because during the plague of 1665, the last great plague, he had to leave university and he went back to Woolsthorpe and he spent 2 years. And in that time, still just a student really, he discovered some of the most critical parts of modern physics. So he kind of did that with his time, and we think about that about him. But he really was, as a young person, he was discovering stuff that now our modern world is completely built on, and it was there to be discovered for the first time. And that is an amazing thought, that people are making discoveries of that magnitude.
Give me a brief idea as to who else you've included amongst the 50 documents in your publication.
Oh, I've got loads of great people. So one of my real favourites is he's a man called Richard Dutch Thompson, because he came from the Netherlands, and he was invited to help translate the King James Bible. And when we think of the King James Bible, we think of this sort of lofty Elizabethan and Jacobean, writing. It's sort of beautiful. It's the gold standard of English. It's written around the same time as Shakespeare. So that's, what we all think of as wondrous English. But this Richard Thompson, he worked with one of the companies of translators, and he was a specialist in some ancient languages. But there was a Puritan. This was a time of big religious divides in the countries between, the Puritans and the sort of Anglo-Catholics. Puritan said of him that Richard Dutch Thompson was a man who was permanently drunk, never went to bed one night sober. And we also know at the same time that he was translating some really quite filthy Roman poetry as another job he was doing on the side. So, you have this image of this guy, whose words get read in church now still as these kind of, weighty words of King James Bible. And, what a character. So, yes, I've loved finding people like that.
Dominic, it's lovely chatting with you. Thank you very much indeed for sparing some time for us. Dominic Selwood, Anatomy of a Nation, a history of British identity in 50 documents. And I think what's going to be lovely about it is that it'll be unusual stories that you won't have even thought of, all brought together there. So lovely chatting with Dominic this afternoon.